Gerald Foss picked up a rock the size of a dinner plate and threw it into the tree line without looking where it landed. He had already thrown 17 rocks that morning. His back hurt. His coffee was cold. And the neighbor, watching him from across the fence, had the audacity to laugh out loud. Not a polite chuckle, a real laugh, the kind you reserve for someone doing something spectacularly, irreversibly dumb. Gerald did not turn around. He just bent down and picked up another rock. That was the first morning of what would become, 14 months later, one of the strangest agricultural success stories anyone in that county had heard in a long time. But you would never have guessed that from watching him stand in 14 acres of broken, stubborn, sun-baked pasture that refused, by every agronomic measure ever devised, to grow a single thing worth selling. And yet, he never once considered leaving. Why? That question is worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. What does a retired mailman know about land that 3 generations of farmers before him had already given up on? Turns out quite a lot, just not in the way anyone expected. Gerald spent 31 years walking routes in a mid-sized rural town. Not driving, walking. He logged somewhere between 11 and 14 miles per day, 5 days a week, for 3 decades. By the time he retired, he had worn through more boots than he could count and developed an unusual habit of noticing ground. Not landscape, ground specifically, the texture of it, the way gravel held heat longer than grass on cold autumn mornings, the way certain patches of a yard would stay dry when everything around them went soggy after rain. He noticed things other people walked past because walking past was literally his job. When Gerald bought the 14-acre parcel 2 years before this story begins, he paid under market value for an obvious reason. The land had been surveyed twice by county extension agents, and both times the conclusion was the same. The rocky pasture was structurally unsuitable for conventional crops. The soil depth was inconsistent. The limestone outcroppings broke up any chance of even irrigation. One of the agents used the phrase agriculturally marginal in the official report, which is the polite bureaucratic way of saying this land is mostly a problem. Gerald read the report, folded it in half, tucked it in a drawer, and bought the land anyway. His daughter thought it was grief talking. His wife had passed 14 months before the purchase, and the family worried he was making decisions from a foggy emotional place. Maybe. He never addressed that theory directly. What he did say, more than once, was that he had delivered mail to a beekeeper on the east side of town for 11 years, a man named Darnell, and that he had watched Darnell's operation go from 3 hives to 47 over that same period. Gerald had asked questions. Darnell had answered them. That was the seed, planted quietly over 11 years of daily delivery stops, of what Gerald would eventually attempt on 14 acres of rock and thin soil that everyone else had written off. The plan, when he finally said it out loud at a family dinner, landed with all the grace of a brick through a window. His son-in-law put his fork down. His daughter stared at him. He was going to raise bees on rocky pasture land in a region that wasn't known for high-yield honey production, using a strategy he had partially invented based on something he'd observed while delivering mail. They all loved him very much. They also thought he had lost his mind. Here's the thing about limestone and heat. Most people treat rocky pasture as an obstacle because that's the most obvious response to it. The rocks are in the way of tillage. They damage equipment. They make planting uneven. The conventional move is to remove them, which costs money, or to abandon the field, which is what had happened to Gerald's 14 acres repeatedly over the decades. But Gerald, during all those years of walking routes, had noticed something specific about stone surfaces and temperature regulation. On mornings that dipped near freezing, the gravel driveways and slate walkways of the houses on his route were often noticeably warmer to the touch than the surrounding grass. Stone absorbs and holds solar heat differently than soil or vegetation. Gerald, who had never studied thermodynamics, had spent 31 years conducting an accidental, informal experiment in thermal observation simply by touching surfaces as he walked. He wasn't certain his logic was right, but he had a theory that the rocky outcroppings on his land, arranged in natural clusters, could function as passive heat sinks around beehives, moderating the temperature swings that stress colonies during early spring and late autumn, the two periods when hive losses are statistically highest. It was an elegant idea. It was also almost entirely untested at the scale he was imagining. And when he described it to his neighbor for the first time, the laughing started. It would not stop for several months. Gerald drove to see Darnell, the beekeeper from his old mail route, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, about 3 weeks after he'd bought the land. He showed up with a notebook and a lot of questions. Darnell was in his late 60s, had been keeping bees commercially for over 30 years, and had the calloused hands and slow speech pattern of someone who had stopped being surprised by much of anything. He listened to Gerald explain the thermal sink idea without interrupting. When Gerald finished, Darnell was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Gerald would repeat many times later, that the worst beekeepers he had ever seen were the ones who tried to remove every variable, and the best ones were usually the ones who learned to use the land's quirks instead of fighting them. Darnell agreed to visit the site. He walked the 14 acres slowly, crouching near the limestone clusters, picking up flat rocks and holding them at certain angles to assess orientation. He said the southern-facing slopes of the rocky outcroppings were promising. He also said Gerald would need to spend significant time on forage. The wildflower and clover situation on the land was nearly non-existent, and no matter how thermally favorable the hive placement was, starving bees produced no honey. That was problem number one. It would not be the last. The forage situation was grimmer than Gerald initially understood. He had budgeted for seed and figured he would plant a mix of clover, phacelia, and wildflower varieties across the workable patches between rock clusters, areas where the soil, thin as it was, could support shallow-rooted flowering plants. What he did not account for was the soil pH. The limestone content of the land had pushed the pH into territory that made several of his planned seed varieties nearly useless. His first planting attempt in late spring of the first year yielded almost nothing that survived beyond 3 weeks. He stood in a field of yellowed, stunted seedlings and felt, for the first time since buying the property, the particular cold feeling of realizing you might have badly miscalculated. His daughter called that week to check in. He told her the forage was establishing nicely. He was not ready to be right about this in front of an audience yet. He needed to fix it first. Darnell came back, looked at the soil results, and recommended switching to species that actually benefit from alkaline conditions: sweet clover, borage, and a specific strain of Alsike clover that performs well in high pH environments. Gerald replanted. The second attempt took, slowly, unevenly, in patches that looked almost accidental, but it took. While the forage was still struggling, Gerald made his second significant error. He placed his first 6 hives in positions that felt logical by visual inspection, tucked against large rock faces on the southern edge of the property. What he had not measured carefully enough was wind exposure. That particular corner of the land funneled prevailing westerly winds with surprising force during autumn, and 3 of the 6 hives suffered from what Darnell called chronic cold stress, colonies that were thermally disrupted enough to slow brood production significantly heading into winter. 2 colonies came through weaker than they should have. 1 did not come through at all. Gerald lost that hive in February of the first winter. He sat with that loss longer than was strictly efficient. He had not expected to feel the loss of a colony the way he did. Not grief exactly, but something close to it. A quiet, heavy awareness that the living thing he was responsible for had not made it, and that the decision he'd made about wind exposure had contributed to that. He repositioned the remaining hives the following spring, using rock formations to create natural windbreaks on the exposed corners, which was, quietly, the first real validation of his original thermal theory, using the stone not just for warmth, but for protection. Darnell approved. He also said, "I told you to measure the wind," with the energy of a man who very much had told him to measure the wind. If you're still watching this and want to see where it ends up, because it does end up somewhere genuinely unexpected, this would be the moment to subscribe. Stories like Gerald's are easy to summarize in a headline, but the actual texture of how they unfold, the specific errors and small realizations and conversations in muddy fields, that part is what's worth following. There are more stories like this one waiting. Now back to the 14 acres. Spring of the second year arrived with better forage, repositioned hives, and Gerald's first meaningful honey yield. Modest, about 63 pounds from 11 hives, which is well below commercial average but represented something that had not existed on that land in any prior recorded use, a sellable product. He brought a sample jar to Darnell. Darnell opened it, smelled it, dipped a finger, tasted it. He was quiet. Then he said it had a quality he described as mineral, a specific flavor note that he attributed to the forage growing in alkaline soil among limestone rock. Floral, but with a dry, almost stony finish. He had seen this before in certain quarry-adjacent operations in other regions. He said it carefully, like he was testing whether Gerald was ready to hear it. This honey might have genuine market differentiation. It was not ordinary clover honey. It tasted like the land it came from, including the parts of the land everyone had told Gerald to give up on. That tasting conversation changed the operational direction of everything that followed. Gerald had been thinking about his operation as a standard honey production setup that happened to have an unusual hive placement strategy. After talking to Darnell and doing some research on what was starting to be called terroir honey in specialty food markets, the same concept that makes wine from a specific hillside taste different from wine made 100 miles away, he began to understand that the rocky pasture was not a liability he had learned to work around. It was the product. The stones, the alkaline soil, the unusual forage species, the specific mineral composition of the limestone outcroppings, all of it was expressing itself in the honey in a way that had genuine commercial value to buyers who cared about origin and flavor complexity. He started keeping detailed records of which rock clusters each hive was positioned near, what forage was dominant in that hive's foraging radius, and how the honey from each hive varied in color and taste profile. This was not the approach of a hobbyist. It was the approach of someone who had spent 31 years walking the same routes until he understood them in molecular detail, and was now applying that same patient, systematic attention to 14 acres of ground everyone else had abandoned. The third technical failure came in early summer of that second year, and it was the most embarrassing one because it was the most preventable. Gerald had scaled up to 19 hives. The forage was stronger. Colony health had improved dramatically since the windbreak repositioning. He was feeling, perhaps for the first time, genuinely confident. And then he discovered that his extraction setup, the manual extractor he had been using, suitable for a hobbyist operation with half a dozen hives, was completely inadequate for the volume of frames he was now pulling. He damaged comb on 14 frames trying to rush extraction with undersized equipment. Lost product. Contaminated a small batch with wax debris from the damaged comb because he did not have proper filtration in place. He salvaged most of it, but the episode cost him time, product, and briefly, temporarily, the clean consistency of quality he had been building toward. He spent 2 weeks reading equipment specifications he should have read 4 months earlier, invested in a properly sized radial extractor, added a 3-stage filtration system, rebuilt his extraction workflow from scratch with the kind of methodical, slightly grim attention to detail that suggested he was not going to make that particular mistake twice. He did not make it twice. By the time autumn of the second year arrived, Gerald had 23 functioning hives across the 14-acre property. He had developed what he called his rock map, a hand-drawn chart of every significant limestone formation on the land, annotated with hive positions, forage zones, wind exposure ratings, and seasonal temperature notes he had been recording since the first winter. It looked, if you saw it laid flat on his kitchen table, like something between a military survey and a piece of outsider art. Dense with notation, personal shorthand that only he fully understood. Darnell visited again in October and spent a long time with the rock map. He said quietly that Gerald had done something that commercial beekeepers almost never do. He had made his specific land into a working system rather than imposing a generic system onto the land. There was a difference. Most people in agriculture, Darnell said, arrive at a piece of ground and begin subtracting, removing obstacles, leveling variation, standardizing conditions. Gerald had done the opposite. He had read the land until he understood what it was offering, and then he had said yes to that offer, even when everyone around him said the offer wasn't real. That October, Gerald had enough finished product to approach 3 specialty food retailers in the region. He brought samples, he brought his rock map, because he believed in showing people where something came from. He sold out of every jar they agreed to take on consignment within 11 days. The name that stuck was Quarry Honey. Gerald had not planned to name it that. One of the shop owners, a woman who ran a small artisan food market about 40 minutes from the property, used that phrase when she called to reorder, saying her customers kept asking for that Quarry Honey. Gerald let it become the name. It fit. It was accurate. And it communicated something immediately to buyers who encountered it. This honey came from a specific, unusual place, and it tasted that way for a reason. By the 14th month after he'd first thrown that rock into the tree line on an early morning with cold coffee and a sore back, Gerald had a waiting list, not a suggestion of interest, a literal list of buyers. Specialty retailers, a regional restaurant group, 2 online specialty food platforms, all waiting for production that he had not yet harvested. His operation had outpaced his current scale. He had a quality problem in the best possible sense, more demand than supply, rooted in something that could not easily be replicated anywhere else because it depended on the specific, unrepeatable geology of a 14-acre pasture that had been declared agriculturally useless by 2 separate county assessments. His neighbor, the one who had laughed on that first morning, stopped by in November of that second year. Gerald was in the field, checking on hive insulation before the cold set in, moving methodically between rock clusters in the low afternoon light. The neighbor walked over. There was a pause of the kind that carries about 15 different unspoken things. Eventually, the neighbor asked how it was going. Gerald said it was going all right. The neighbor looked at the hives, the rocks, the hand-annotated markers Gerald had placed near each formation. He did not say he was sorry for laughing. Gerald did not ask him to. They stood there for a moment in the comfortable, awkward silence of 2 people who both understood what was not being said, and then Gerald offered him a jar from the batch he was carrying to his truck. The neighbor took it, held it up to the light. The honey had a particular amber color, darker than standard clover, almost copper-tinted from the barrage and sweet clover forage on alkaline ground. He did not say anything complimentary. He just tucked the jar under his arm and walked back to his side of the fence. Gerald watched him go and then went back to checking hives. That was the closest thing to vindication he got from that particular direction. It was enough. What Gerald actually built on that land, when you step back and look at the whole arc of it, is not quite what people assume when they hear man turns bad land good. The land was not transformed. The rocks are still there. The soil is still thin and alkaline and unsuitable for anything conventional. The county extension report is still technically accurate. The land cannot support standard crops. What changed was not the land. It was the interpretive frame applied to the land. Gerald stopped asking what the land could be made to do and started asking what the land was already doing that he could work with. And the answer, hidden in plain sight in the thermal properties of limestone formations and the flavor compounds that alkaline soil imparts to flowering plants, was something genuinely valuable that no amount of conventional agricultural improvement would have produced. You cannot grow quarry honey on regular farmland. The regular farmland is the wrong ingredient. The wrongness, the rockiness, the stubborn geological inconvenience of that 14-acre parcel, that was not the problem to be solved. It was the product to be understood. That realization, which sounds simple in a sentence, took Gerald 14 months and 3 specific painful failures and 31 years of walking routes and noticing ground to arrive at. It does not arrive faster than that. There is no shortcut to the version of knowledge that comes from paying careful, sustained, patient attention to something other people have already decided to ignore. Darnell came to the property one last time in the story we are following here. A cold morning in late autumn, just as the waiting list had started to grow beyond what Gerald could reasonably fulfill alone. He walked the rock map route that Gerald had developed, stopping at each cluster, looking at the hives in their winter wraps, the stone formations holding their heat the way Gerald had theorized they would back before anyone believed him. Darnell did not say much on that walk. He rarely did. When they got back to the truck, he told Gerald that he thought the operation could support 38 hives at proper density without overloading the forage base, which would mean roughly tripling the current output without compromising the flavor profile that made the product distinctive. He said it the way you say something that you think the other person already knows but needs permission to believe. Gerald wrote down the number. 38. He looked at his rock map. He had already identified, without quite admitting it to himself, exactly where he would place the next 15 hives. The stones were already there. They had always been there. He just needed to stop apologizing for them and start using them. There is a version of this story where the conclusion is triumphant and tidy. Retired mailman beats the odds, proves neighbors wrong, builds successful business from nothing. That version is satisfying, but it misses the texture of what actually happened. The hive Gerald lost in February stayed lost. The 14 frames of damaged comb from the extraction mistake represented real product that never made it to a jar. The daughter who worried about her father in the months after her mother's death watched him spend money on land that looked for a long time like a mistake, and the worry she felt in those months was real and not entirely unfounded, because the whole thing could have collapsed. Gerald himself would tell you that the turning points were not moments of confidence. They were moments of recalculation after failure. The decision to reposition hives after the winter loss was not triumphant. It was quiet and a little sad and very practical. The decision to rebuild the extraction workflow was not inspiring. It was corrective. The work between the failures was just work. Slow, unglamorous, solitary work on a piece of ground that smelled like stone and clover, and the particular clean sharpness of beeswax in cold air. That is what it actually looked like from the inside, not a redemption arc, a long, careful argument with a piece of land conducted in the language of observation and adjustment and stubborn, inarticulate faith that the argument was worth having. Gerald Foss, retired mailman, owner of 14 acres of rocky pasture in a county that classified his land as agriculturally marginal, had a waiting list of buyers for a product that did not exist 14 months before they started asking for it. He was 64 years old. He had bad knees from 3 decades of walking routes and a tendency to get up before sunrise to check on his hives, even on mornings when there was no practical reason to do so. He kept his rock map folded in his jacket pocket most days. He was not finished learning. He knew that clearly. Darnell had told him he would face a different set of challenges at the scale of 38 hives, problems around swarm management and queen replacement frequency and forage competition that he had not yet encountered. There would be more failures. He was not afraid of that in the way he had been afraid of the first one. The first one teaches you that failure inside a project you believe in is different from failure of the project itself. Once you understand that difference, the failures stop being reasons to stop and start being information. Gerald understood that difference. He had understood it in a different form for 31 years of walking routes in weather that ranged from pleasant to miserable, delivering things that mattered and things that didn't, noticing the temperature of gravel driveways on cold mornings, accumulating the slow, unspectacular, irreplaceable knowledge of a person who pays attention to what is actually in front of them. That is where the honey came from. Not from inspiration, from attention, from the specific stubborn refusal to look at a difficult piece of ground and see only what it could not do. The rocks were always going to be there. The question was always only whether he was going to spend his time resenting them or learning their language. He chose learning. The buyers lined up because of that choice. But more importantly, the choice was its own reward long before anyone was paying for the result.